All right, welcome in everyone to the deep dive. We're going to dive into some really interesting stuff today.
I'm looking forward to it.
We got this really unique set of sources from a listener, and they specifically asked for us to consider them from a Catholic perspective.
Right. Really fascinating mix of topics, too.
So we've got articles from the BMJ on, like, medical ethics, the history of being a doctor as a profession. We've got a case study about a really unusual diagnosis, Malthus Slew and his theories on population, then some stuff on the origins of HIV, and even the future of scientific publishing. You know, how all this stuff's going to look in the digital world.
Yeah, definitely a wide range, but there are definitely some threads running through it all.
Totally. So that's what we're going to try to do. Pull out those core themes, see what kind of connections we can make, especially thinking about them from, that Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
So where do you want to jump in first?
Well, let's start with the foundation, right? The ethical principles that kind of guide medicine, how those have developed, how they're being rethought even now.
Okay, sounds good.
And there's this whole discussion around the resurgence of oaths and ethical codes in medicine. It's really interesting. Like, we always talk about the Hippocratic Oath, right? Like, it's this kind of timeless, rock solid foundation. But when you really dig into it, it has this really kind of messy history.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the Hippocratic Corpus, which is the collection of writings it comes from, it wasn't actually the work of just Hippocrates himself. It was probably lots of different authors over a long period. So there were actually inconsistencies in it right from the start.
Huh. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. And then, like, when you get into the specifics of the traditional oath, there are some pretty strong stances on abortion, euthanasia, those kinds of things, which are huge, obviously, in Catholic thought. Plus, some pretty outdated views on women in medicine. It's a real reminder of how ethical frameworks can, shift and change with time.
Right. You can definitely see how society and understanding change over time, yeah.
Totally. And in modern versions of the oath, a lot of times those older stances are, taken out or rewritten completely. But at the same time, there's this renewed focus on having those formal ethical commitments in medicine. And it seems like that's driven by all the changes we're seeing in healthcare these days, like the crazy speed of scientific discoveries and all the new ethical questions they bring up.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like there's new stuff to think about ethically almost every day now.
Absolutely. So talking about that original Hippocratic Code, the article lays out these core principles, like what was a physician actually expected to commit to?
Yeah, what were the big ones?
Well, the biggest ones were benefiting patients, and the flip side, avoiding harm. Then there's this commitment not to give deadly drugs or anything that could cause an abortion, and it emphasizes purity and holiness in your work.
I bet that resonates with people of faith, yeah.
For sure. Interestingly, it also said doctors shouldn't do surgery for bladder stones. Leave that to the specialists. Yeah. And it stressed that when you go into people's homes, it's only for the benefit of the sick person. No funny business, no corruption, and of course, keeping everything confidential.
Right. It's amazing to see how a lot of those ideas are still central to medical ethics today.
Yeah. Although the article does compare it to this revised version drafted by the British Medical Association, the BMA.
Oh, interesting. So what's different in their take on things? What do they emphasize?
Well, the BMA draft, it focuses more on the doctor's active duties, like actually going out and helping people who are sick, preventing harm. And there's this huge emphasis on listening to patients and, like, actually giving them the best care based on the evidence you have. It's all about honesty, respect, compassion, and a really clear respect for patient rights, especially for the most vulnerable people.
So you can really see how the focus has shifted over time from more passive commitments to this more active, patient-centered approach.
Exactly.
The article also mentions this idea of a pan-professional oath. So not just for doctors, but for everyone who works in healthcare.
Right, everyone. Nurses, therapists, administrators, you name it.
Yeah. What's the thinking behind that? Why would they want to have something like that?
Well, it's recognizing that, modern healthcare is a team effort. And a lot of times people in different roles are going to run into ethical dilemmas. A shared oath could help everyone be on the same page ethically, make sure everyone's working toward the same goals when it comes to patient care.
I guess it could avoid situations where, a doctor wants to do one thing, but a nurse has a different ethical concern.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for you listening, I think about all these principles, these ethical ideas that have been there for so long and how they're evolving even now. How does that fit with what you believe as a Catholic? Think about that huge respect for the sanctity of life, the dignity of every person, that call to compassion and service, especially for those who are suffering. How does all of this history of medical ethics shape how you see healthcare today?
Yeah, it's a rich history, and it definitely makes you think.
For sure. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about what it means to be a professional in medicine. It's more than just knowing the science.
Right. It's a whole different dimension. Like Cruz and Cruz, they make this clear distinction between a doctor as a healer and a doctor as a professional. So the healer focuses on the direct care of the patient, one-on-one. But the professional has responsibilities to society as a whole. It's about upholding the integrity of the medical field, doing administrative work, maintaining that public trust.
And that trust is a big one. It's not like doctors just get to decide they're professionals, right? It's something that society gives them, and it's based on whether people believe doctors are going to do the right thing.
Exactly. Society gives these professions a lot of power and freedom, but that depends on everyone trusting that these professionals are competent, ethical, and acting in everyone's best interests.
Okay, so when we talk about professions, what actually makes something a profession?
Well, the article lays out a bunch of characteristics. Having a very specialized body of knowledge, being able to control their own practices through professional associations, having formal mandates like licensing, being the recognized authority on, their area of expertise, and also the long education and training, control over who gets into the profession, the responsibility for setting their own ethical and technical standards, and the autonomy of individual doctors.
So there's a lot of self-governance in there.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, it's all balanced by this need to maintain public trust.
Exactly.
Now, the article also talks about how the public's view of doctors, of medical professionalism, has changed over time. It's not like people have always had this blind trust.
Right. It's had its ups and downs. At first, the whole idea of professionalism was seen pretty positively. It was all about, altruistic service, helping society. But, especially in the middle of the 20th century, people started getting more critical.
What were they worried about?
Well, they were worried about conflicts of interest, about doctors not regulating themselves well enough, about the profession putting its own interests ahead of patients and, the public good.
So that idea of, like, doctors protecting other doctors, even when they've done something wrong.
Exactly.
And it seems like more recently, people have started to value professionalism in medicine again, but there are still those worries about maintaining public trust. It's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, the authors, they make a really strong case for actually teaching professionalism as part of medical education.
Yeah, like actually making it part of the curriculum.
Why is that so important?
Well, their point is that if we want doctors to understand all their obligations, which go way beyond just, clinical skills, then you've got to actually teach them about it. They need to understand the history of the profession, the ethics, what society expects of them.
Right. Makes sense.
So it's not just what you learn in the lab or the operating room. It's all this other stuff, too.
Okay. So for you listening, think about this idea of medicine as a calling, as a vocation, and not just a job, and how that idea of service, which is so important in the Catholic faith, connects to the responsibilities of being a doctor. How does being Catholic, with its emphasis on virtue, integrity, serving others, how does that shape how you understand trust and accountability in healthcare? It's something to think about.
Absolutely.
Now, this next article, it gets into the issue of accountability head on. It actually argues for a whole new agency to investigate when doctors do something wrong. It makes you wonder how well the medical profession polices itself, make sure its members are actually following the rules.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely brings up some uncomfortable questions. Like in the UK, they have the General Medical Council, the GMC. This article basically says they're not doing enough to handle complaints about doctors.
So what are they proposing instead?
They want to create this whole new body, an office for medical standards that would have some serious power to look into these issues.
Like what kind of power?
Well, they'd be able to do routine audits of medical practice, give whistleblowers a safe way to report problems, actually investigate patient complaints, review medical records, and even publications if they suspect fraud or misconduct. They'd have a confidential helpline, legal power to get documents, and the ability to use, proper investigative methods. Plus, they'd be constantly reviewing and trying to improve the standards of medical practice overall.
Wow. That's a pretty big overhaul.
Yeah, it sounds like they're trying to create a system that's a lot more proactive.
Yeah, definitely. The article even gives some examples of doctors who were kicked out of the profession for serious misconduct. We're not talking about, small mistakes here.
Right. They talk about cases of fake drug trials, falsifying research data, misdiagnosing patients over and over again, and even selling treatments that haven't been proven to work. It's some pretty scary stuff.
For you, our listener, thinking about all of this, consider how important integrity and accountability are in every profession, but especially those dealing with people's health. Catholic social teaching puts a huge emphasis on justice, honesty, protecting the vulnerable, and our responsibility to each other. How do those ideas connect to the need for strong ways to address misconduct in healthcare? How do you think Catholic teaching can help us understand the need for better accountability in this area?
Yeah, it's a big question. And then we have this completely different kind of story, this almost unbelievable case where a woman's brain tumor was seemingly diagnosed based on her hallucinations.
I remember reading about that. Just wild.
It really is. This woman starts hearing voices telling her she has a brain tumor and needs a scan. And what happened after that is just mind-blowing. It really makes you question what we know about diagnosis and, how we perceive reality.
So she's hearing these voices. What happens next?
Well, at first, doctors diagnose her with a functional hallucinatory psychosis. Basically, there's no clear physical reason for the voices. She gets counseling, medication, which does quiet the voices for a bit.
Okay. But they come back.
Yeah, while she's on vacation, they come back, but even stronger. And this time, they're really specific. They tell her she needs to get to England immediately, go to a specific hospital, and get a CT scan. They even say she has a brain tumor and an inflamed brainstem.
The doctors, they must have been skeptical, right?
Of course. It's a crazy story. But eventually they do a scan and, get this, they actually find a meningioma, a type of brain tumor, just like the voices said.
No way. And she didn't have any other symptoms?
No, nothing that would usually point to a brain tumor, so it's totally bizarre. But the scan confirms what the voices were saying. They get a neurosurgeon. She has surgery to remove the tumor. And then, the craziest part. When she wakes up, the voices tell her they're happy they could help, and then they just vanish. And so do her psychotic symptoms.
So the tumor's gone, the voices are gone, everything's back to normal.
Pretty much. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
Yeah. When this case was presented at a conference, it caused a huge debate. Nobody could really agree on what it all meant.
What were some of the theories people had?
Well, some people thought it was telepathy, like maybe someone with psychic powers sensed the tumor and was trying to help her. Others thought maybe she made the whole thing up, consciously or unconsciously. And then there were some who thought maybe she was having really subtle physical sensations from the tumor, and her mind just, turned that anxiety into hallucinations, somehow making connections to hospitals and being sick.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it's hard to rule anything out in a case like this.
Absolutely. But the fact that her psychiatric problems completely disappeared right after the tumor was removed, it really suggests a strong link between the physical and the mental.
For sure.
I mean, it's a really remarkable case.
So, for you listening, this story is almost like a challenge. How do we understand something like this, especially from a Catholic perspective? It's all about that relationship between the mind, body, and spirit and how they all work together. Could something like divine intervention be at play? I mean, this case really pushes the boundaries of what we know about medicine and makes us think about all the things we still don't understand about the human experience. It's a reminder that we don't have all the answers, and sometimes things happen that we just can't fully explain.
Yeah, it's pretty humbling.
Now let's shift gears again and talk about Thomas Malthus and his ideas about population and resources. It's been over 200 years since he wrote his famous essay, but it still sparks debate today, especially when we think about sustainability and all that.
Yeah. Malthus, he was a fascinating guy. Not just a mathematician, but a clergyman, too. And his faith really shaped his thinking on these big societal issues.
Okay. Remind us of his main argument.
His central idea was that there's this fundamental tension between how fast populations grow, which he thought was geometric, and how fast we can increase food production, which he said was arithmetic. And he thought this difference in growth rates was going to cause all sorts of problems.
Right. Like people were going to outgrow the available resources.
Exactly.
And he was pretty critical of how society helped poor people back then, wasn't he? Like the old English poor laws.
Yeah. He thought those laws, which were supposed to help people in poverty, actually made things worse. He argued they discouraged people from working hard and encouraged them to have more kids, which would just put more strain on the system.
So he thought it was kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, he did.
But then he added this idea of preventive checks.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that?
So, in later editions of his essay, he started talking about ways to limit population growth voluntarily. He called it moral restraint. He meant things like waiting to get married until you could actually afford kids and being, restrained within marriage, not having too many children.
Interesting. So he was acknowledging that people could make choices to limit family size.
Right. But he was totally against artificial birth control.
So even though his views could be pretty harsh, it sounds like he was trying to grapple with some really important social issues.
He was. The article talks about how he actually had some progressive ideas, like being in favor of universal education. But then, you've got that famous quote of his about no vacant cover at nature's feast.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Definitely. It
Yeah.
shows how he believed that if you were born poor and couldn't support yourself, you didn't really have a right to exist. It was pretty brutal.
For sure. But it's important to remember that he was also really concerned about the problems of the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
the suffering he saw around him.
Right. His analysis was definitely flawed, but he was trying to understand poverty and find solutions.
Ultimately, his big prediction about mass starvation and societal collapse in England didn't happen. Why not?
Well, a bunch of things changed. Agriculture got a lot more efficient, so they could produce way more food. The Industrial Revolution created jobs, wages went up, and people's lives generally improved. And then, of course, contraception became much more common, so people could control how many kids they had, even though Malthus himself didn't like that idea.
Right, right.
But it's interesting that the article mentions the Club of Rome and their Limits to Growth report, which came out in the 70s. They were worried about the same kind of things as Malthus, just on a global scale. So those questions about population, resources, the environment, they haven't really gone away.
No, they definitely haven't. So, our listener, as you think about all this, how do you reconcile Catholic teachings on the dignity of life, caring for God's creation, the importance of family, with these debates about population and resources? What do you think about the Church's stance on contraception and responsible parenthood? And what role can human ingenuity and just sharing of resources play in tackling these challenges? It's a lot to think about, but it's important.
Okay, so shifting gears again, let's talk about something more modern, the early days of HIV. The article makes the point that understanding where a disease comes from is really important if you want to fight it and prevent future outbreaks.
Right, like detective work almost. You've got to find the source to figure out what to do.
Exactly. And the article even compares it to John Snow's work on cholera back in the 1800s. He figured out that contaminated water was causing the disease and that knowledge helped save a lot of lives.
So, what do we know about where HIV came from?
Well, scientists pretty much agree that it came from monkeys, specifically simian immunodeficiency viruses, or SIDs. They were transmitted from primates to humans, probably in Central Africa. The two main types of HIV, HIV-1 group M and HIV-1 group O, are thought to have come from different types of chimpanzees. And HIV-2, which is less common, it came from sooty mangabes in West Africa.
And how did that happen? Like, how did it go from monkeys to humans?
Probably through direct contact, like hunting or butchering bushmeat.
Makes sense. Now, the article talks about this Norwegian sailor who died in 1976. Why was his case so important?
So they were able to study a sample of HIV from this sailor. It turns out he had a rare form of HIV-1, group O. And the genetic analysis suggests he got it in Cameroon back in the early 60s, like 1961 or 62. So he's the earliest confirmed case of AIDS that we know of.
Wow.
And his travel history shows he was in West Africa around that time, so it really points to that region as the origin of Group O.
Interesting. So all this evidence, the genetic stuff in these early cases, it suggests that HIV emerged pretty quickly. Right.
Scientists talk about a starburst phylogeny, meaning the different subtypes of HIV diverged really rapidly around 1959.
Okay. So how do they explain that sudden burst?
Well, there are two main ideas. The natural transfer theory says that things like growing cities, changing social behavior, and more sexual freedom in Africa, especially after colonialism ended, all created more chances for this animal virus to spread to humans and between humans.
Okay. Makes sense. What's the other theory?
The other one is the iatrogenic introduction theory, which is a bit more controversial. This theory suggests that maybe some medical activities involving primates back in the mid-20th century accidentally helped HIV spread.
Like what kinds of activities?
Things like using monkeys for research or using primate cells to make vaccines, but this theory doesn't have a lot of solid evidence to support it yet.
I see. So it's still a bit of a mystery.
Kind of, yeah.
So for you listening, this whole story of HIV, how it came about, how it spread, it really makes you think about how interconnected everything is, humans and nature. And from a Catholic perspective, how do we think about that relationship? What's our responsibility to other creatures? And how should we approach scientific research, especially when it comes to something like this where the stakes are so high?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to consider.
All right, let's wrap up with something a little more hopeful. The future of scientific publishing. It sounds like the whole way we think about scientific papers is going to change drastically in the digital age.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We might be saying goodbye to those dusty old journals pretty soon.
What kinds of changes are they talking about?
Well, instead of those short printed articles, they're imagining these much longer online publications that are constantly updated. And instead of just reading the conclusions, you'd have access to all the data, all the nitty-gritty details.
And that's interesting, so it's more transparent.
Exactly. And there would be hyperlinks everywhere so you could easily jump to related research, background information, the whole works.
It's like taking a deep dive within a deep dive.
Ah, exactly. And they talk about having online forums where authors and readers can discuss the research directly. Plus, you'd be able to manipulate the data yourself, test the author's analyses, and see exactly who did what on the project.
So it's not just passively reading anymore, it's actually engaging with the research.
Exactly. And then there's this concept of virtual article. It's pretty wild.
Let's say.
Basically, it's like a complete record of the whole research process. Not just the final paper, but the research question, the methods, the raw data, the peer reviews, any updates or changes. It would be like a living document that evolves over time.
So instead of just seeing a snapshot of the research, you're seeing the whole movie.
Exactly. And the really cool thing is that they imagine you'd be able to customize how you view this virtual article, depending on your needs and expertise.
So like different versions for different audiences.
Right. So a scientist could dive into the technical details, while a doctor could focus on the clinical applications, and someone from the public could get a plain language summary. They even talk about using AI to personalize the information based on your interests and knowledge, kind of like how Amazon recommends products.
That's pretty amazing. And a lot more user-friendly than those dense journal articles we're used to.
For sure. They even talk about a dream online paper that would have links to supplementary materials, explanations for non-experts, patient stories, reviewer comments, and even ways for readers to give feedback.
It's almost like turning scientific papers into something closer to Wikipedia, but with like way more depth and rigor.
Yeah, exactly. One of the authors even compares traditional publishing to quantum theory because the information is packaged in these separate fixed units. But they say online publishing is more like wave theory. Everything's connected and constantly in flux.
So it's this idea that knowledge is always evolving, always being refined.
Right. And the online format can actually reflect that. The paper becomes a living document with ongoing discussions, corrections, new findings, and all that.
Really interesting. So for you listening, how do you think all this is going to impact how we learn and share knowledge?
Yeah.
Especially knowledge related to faith and how we understand what it means to be human. It's a whole new world of information out there, and it's changing all the time. So it's more important than ever to think critically, be able to tell good information from bad, and to really consider the ethics of all this new technology. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about those enduring ethical principles in medicine, the responsibilities that come with being a doctor, the importance of honesty and holding people accountable, those strange mysteries of the human experience, our connection to nature, and how the whole way we share scientific knowledge is changing.
A lot to think about.
Yeah. And as you reflect on all of this, we want to leave you with one final thought. Given all these advances in science and medicine, how can we use them to better understand the human person? How can we draw on our faith and reason to promote healing and well-being in this ever-changing world? What new questions or insights did you gain today that you want to explore further? Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion.